Welcome back to Filling in the History. I am the amateur historian, and today we're going to be talking about Doctrine and Covenants, Section 18. And that's it. So this will be a pretty short one. There's going to be, again, a little bit about the history of what this document is, where we get it from, what are the circumstances around it. And then after that, a little bit of a kind of a precursor to the end of an era in the Joseph Smith papers. So we'll get to that in part two, which will be kind of just a bonus sort of actually non-historical, just kind of an opinion piece that I'm going to do. So hopefully it doesn't upset as many people as my First Amendment thing did. But anyway, so yeah, welcome back. We are going to be talking today about Section 18 of the Doctrine and Covenants. And this, if you recall, is actually placed earlier, but for the sake of sort of continuity and a lot of the story and the way that the manuscript history of the church reads out, we're kind of doing them a little bit more in order to kind of keep things in context. So, yeah. So, welcome back. So, earliest copies that we have, this one is not found in Revelation books 1 or 2. It is in the index, which I'll get to in a second. But this is part of all those sections that are lost. So, again, somebody took the gathering out of the Revelation books, and it's gone. We assume that a lot of myself and the editors of the Joseph Smith papers kind of assumed that it was used to publish the Book of Commandments in 1833, which is where we find the earliest version of Section 18. In the Book of Commandments, it shows up as chapter 15. That's where we are. And in 2 years later, in the Doctrine and Covenants first edition, it is found in section 43. So nowhere to be found in Revelation books 1 or 2, but the earliest version that we have is chapter 15 from the Book of Commandments. So a little bit more about the source that we have. If you want to get into the details, this is the index for Revelation book 1. And as you can see, it is found on page 18, or would have been found on page 18 if that wasn't lost. I will say there's a couple of things that come after this, but section 19 onwards, we actually have most of the revelations after that. So my guess, I think other people's as well, they probably just took this gathering out to do a publication of it, and it never got put back. But the good news is that from kind of henceforth, like the back part of section 19 is in the Revelation books, and so from now on we'll be able to see like what, maybe they made some changes, maybe some names were changed or some words were changed, or whatever the case may be. So that's that. Now, originally it was placed between sections 14 and 16. Which is kind of strange. If you remember, 14, 15, and 16, as we currently have them now, are kind of the same. It's all the Whitmers getting revelations for themselves, but for some reason in this case, section 18 comes before 14 and 16, chronologically, at least in the indexes that we have, in the books that we have, from the 1829, 1830 era. And it was actually written to Oliver Cowdery. So the first section, I should be careful with that word. The first portion of section 18 is directly sent to Oliver Cowdery. And then afterwards, David Whitmer sort of shows up. So it's given to Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer at the Whitmer's home in Fayette, New York. And this is the location of the organization of the church. So again, plates are found in Palmyra. They run into a whole lot of nonsense up there. So they have to move to Harmony, Pennsylvania. And that's where Joseph and Oliver do, as we would say today, the book of Mosiah, all the way through to the end of the book, which is the book of Moroni. And then they needed to move again. So they moved from there back to upstate New York into Fayette, New York, which is where Joseph and Oliver translated First Nephi through the Words of Mormon, because that kind of equivalent portion of the Book of Mormon was lost by Martin Harris with the 116 pages in 1829, which was the Book of Lehi, which we have really nothing about that anymore. Those are gone. They were never retranslated. And so now that we're in Fayette, this section is brought about, which has to do with, again, it's directed at Oliver Cowdery. It's directed at David Whitmer. Those two people become two of the three witnesses to the Book of Mormon. And in this case, the three witnesses had two jobs, to put it simply. The first one is that they were to have a very specific divine manifestation of it. I believe we talked about this in the last episode, where not only did, like, the 8 witnesses went into the woods with Joseph Smith, and the 9 of them together got to hold the plates, turn them over, feel them with their hands, like really see them in person. And they wrote their names down, and all 8 of them signed it. And that's in every copy of the Book of Mormon. The 3 witnesses did all of those things, but according to section 17, which is in a previous episode, they also got to see the sword of Laban, the Urim and Thummim itself, the breastplate, which we've talked about. People like Lucy Mack-Smith actually got to feel and sort of see them through a napkin and things like that, but they actually got to experience those items as well. But the sword of Laban was in as part of section 17. They got to see all that stuff. And in that one, the angel Moroni comes down and actually is the one that shows the place to them. So there's a difference there in the story of how those 2 witness events happened. But both of their accounts, both of their sets of signatures are all printed in every copy of the Book of Mormon. And so the other thing that the 3 witnesses did, besides having a bit more of a divine manifestation of these plates, is they were also in this section instructed to choose the 12 apostles, which for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints is a major sort of indication to the world that it is a true church, that it is a restored church, that it has everything that the ancient church had, including apostles. We also claim temples, new scripture, having a prophet on the earth today. All of these things, for many, are signs that it's real. And I believe one of the reasons why this particular section is in the Doctrine and Covenants is because it's a core tenet of the church's teachings about having apostles, about having witnesses and scriptures and all these kinds of things. So that's what we're talking about here. So the 3 witnesses have a divine manifestation. They have a whole, again, section 17 is all about that. But also they are tasked with choosing the 12 apostles. So that's kind of an interesting little footnote. Now, this is in 1829. The apostles were not chosen until 1835. It's kind of a long time. Partly because only 6 official members made up the original church. So the numbers are a little too small to have 12 apostles. But that's what this section is all about. So that's a little bit about the background of it. And so we're in Fayette, New York. It's 1829. The Book of Mormon is not published yet. The church is not organized yet, and they're already talking about coming up with apostles. The earliest version we have of this is in the Book of Commandments. So there you go. So what are the circumstances surrounding this? Well, something I found kind of incidentally interesting to me was that the Book of Commandments and the original Doctrine and Covenants, the one in 1835, the headings are the exact same. The only thing is that the Doctrine and Covenants adds last names. So they don't just say, in the Book of Commandments, for example, it says given to Joseph and David and Oliver, or Oliver and David, sorry. But in the 2 years later, when they do the Doctrine and Covenants, it's Oliver Cowdery and David Whitmer. So they do add those last names. I think probably as a clarification, it makes a lot of sense. So the Book of Commandments introduction says, a revelation to Joseph, Oliver, and David, making known the calling of 12 disciples in these last days, and also instructions relative to building up the Church of Christ according to the fullness of the gospel, given in Fayette, New York, June 1829. So it may also be an interesting thing to note that in 1833, the church's name was not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints yet. So that was forthcoming. It was called the Church of Christ previous to that. The Doctrine and Covenants says the same thing, except for it adds last names. So that's the introduction that we get. In 1981's edition, which is what a lot of Latter-day Saints grew up with, that's when they sort of, the one stick in the hand speech that is given by Bruce, no, it was not Bruce Omerconke, it was Boyd K. Packer that gave that speech. But anyway, they had all these footnotes and they changed headings and they did a lot of stuff to the scriptures in 1981. Has a very different introduction than any other versions that we have. It says, Revelation to Joseph Smith the prophet, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer, given at Fayette, New York, June 1829, according to the history of the church. When the Aaronic priesthood was conferred, the bestowal of the Melchizedek priesthood was promised. See heading to section 13. In response to supplication for knowledge on the matter, the Lord gave this revelation. Okay. Now, in 2013, and this is a post-Joseph Smith Papers world that we're living in 2013, The heading is very different. It says, Revelation to Joseph Smith the prophet, Oliver Cowdery, and David Whitmer, given at Fayette, New York, June 1829. According to the prophet, this revelation made known the calling of 12 apostles in these last days, and also instructions relative to building up the church. So, kind of in a way goes back to what the Book of Commandments says, but I find it interesting that this is one of the, to this point anyway, these section headings are very different. And when they came out with the 2013 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants, they made some changes to this. It wasn't just dates or taking away the history of the church reference here. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thing I stumbled across while I was looking at this. So from the historical introduction from Documents Volume 1, the Fayette translation, again, is underway. They've already, and they're kind of in the middle of this, or probably they may be done. From First Nephi, 2 Words of Mormon in Fayette. This is the later location for where the church is organized. And so who's the audience here and why? Well, we get this from historical introduction. Although the first portion of the revelation is addressed to Oliver Cowdery, the remainder provides direction for Cowdery and David Whitmer jointly, including a call for them to find 12 disciples. The revelation then speaks to an intended future audience for Joseph Smith's revelation, addressing these unidentified 12 disciples. Previous revelations had always addressed the individuals directly involved as they or a scribe recorded the words Joseph Smith dictated. So I find this is interesting. We're kind of departing from a few things right now. In fact, this is the first, it's always going to have a reference to it, but we're starting to depart from the Book of Mormon being the main source of information in the Doctrine and Covenants. Our church history is kind of going on from that. Now, always we're going to be referencing scriptures and stuff, so I'm not saying we're going to abandon it completely, but the translation is kind of coming to a close and they're moving on to the next thing. So it's kind of an interesting point in church history. So a couple of things about terminology. You may notice that I was talking about 12 apostles, and it says here disciples. Well, there's some explanations we get, again, from the historical introduction to this document in Documents Volume 1. While the Book of Mormon uses both disciples and apostles, distinguishing between the 12 disciples in America and the 12 apostles in Jerusalem, the term seems to refer to comparable offices. This revelation uses the term disciple to describe the calling of the 12, but it is unclear whether in 1829 Joseph Smith and Cowdery thought of the terms disciple and apostle as interchangeable as they did later. It is also not known when Cowdery and Whitmer began to search for the 12 disciples or apostles. At a conference of the church on the 26th of October, 1831, Cowdery informed those in attendance that he had recently been told that the 12 would be ordained and sent forth from the land of Zion. In February 1835, when 12 apostles were called, Cowdery stated that since the time of this revelation in 1829, our minds have been on a constant stretch to find who these 12 were. And by stretch, I think they meant search, but maybe that's a 19th century word. So there is an understanding in the church today that I think probably had its roots back here, where Jesus goes to the Holy Land and is crucified and resurrected, and there are 12 apostles. 2 of them are replaced, right? And there's 12 apostles there, Peter, James, John, and so forth. And the belief is that Jesus Christ, after he was resurrected, came to the American continent and visited the Nephite, I call it the Lehite, but the Nephite Lamanite people, and also called 12 leaders. But in the Book of Mormon, they are not called apostles. They are called disciples. So basically you have disciples here and apostles there, because there can only be 12 apostles. So it's an interesting thing that distinction is very clear. Whereas in the early church here, they're kind of used interchangeably. I do know that there seem to have been distinctions between like a member and somebody who held the priesthood, and somebody who was an apostle, those were kind of separate classes of members back when the church was very small. And now, obviously, there's all sorts of other things that have been introduced in the church. So just a kind of a little terminology thing that might be maybe confusing to some, but that's, I know in modern Latter-day Saint theology, the disciples are the American 12 and the apostles are the Middle Eastern 12. So that's something that we hold to this day, if that's an issue for anybody. So the manuscript history introduction, this again is draft 2. We keep going back to draft 2. We love draft 2. I wanted to share this because it gives a little bit more of a context from an official history that was sort of dictated by Joseph Smith, written mostly by James Mulholland. We get this. We now became anxious to have the promise realized to us, which the angel had conferred upon us, the Aaronic priesthood, had given us, viz., that provided we continued faithful, we should also have the Melchizedek priesthood, which holds the authority of the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost. We had for some time made this matter a subject of humble prayer, and at length we got together in the chamber of Mr. Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Sr.'s house, in order more particularly to seek of the Lord that we now so earnestly desired. The word of the Lord came unto us in the chamber, commanding us that I should ordain Oliver Cowdery to be an elder in the Church of Jesus Christ, and that he also should ordain me to the same office according, and then to ordain others as it should be made known unto us from time to time. We were, however, commanded to defer this, our ordination, until such times as it should be practicable to have our brethren, who had been and who should be baptized, assembled together, when we must have their sanction, and our thus proceeding to ordain each other, and have them decide by vote whether they were willing to accept us as spiritual teachers or not. When also we were commanded to bless bread and break it with them, and to take wine, bless it, and drink it with them. Afterward proceed to ordain each other according to commandment, then call out such men as the Spirit should dictate, and ordain them, and then attend to the laying on of hands for the gift of the Holy Ghost upon all those whom we had previously baptized, doing all things in the name of the Lord. So I've kept this entire thing in here because there's a few things in here that are interesting. The first portion of it would explain why the 1981 is saying, the 1981 version of this, the section heading from section 18, talks about how they got the Aaronic priesthood. They were looking forward to the Melchizedek priesthood. They were praying about it. They got this revelation. That's where that comes from. So that wasn't like some made up thing. However, on the flip side of it, I find it interesting. There's a couple of things that are sort of introduced here before they're ever really given in an official revelation. The first one is a very important thing in the church today, which is called common consent. That these guys didn't just go at it with each other. They had to be consented to, and every member of the church was supposed to raise their hand and say, yes, I vote to support you, or I say, no, you shouldn't have it. So I find it interesting that there was this sort of constraint before it was ever really made official. We get that in section 20. Which is not far away, obviously, but yeah. So first introduction to this concept of common consent in the church, which is something we still do to this day. The first ideas of having sacrament meetings. I know they had one in the first conference of the church on the 6th of April, 1820, but this is something that the Latter-day Saints do every Sunday, except for general conferences, ironically now. Like we used to always do it during conferences, and now we don't. But that's just kind of a logistical thing, I think, for the most part, and some other reasons why. But yeah, every Sunday we have these sacrament meetings, and this revelation is the first indication of that practice. And then, well, we'll get to that when that episode comes along, but section 20 will explain most of this. It'll talk about what the sacrament prayers are. It'll talk about common consent. So it's kind of interesting that this is an inkling of organization, right? 12 apostles, a structure to the church, priesthood orders, sacrament meetings, common consent of people. We don't just we don't have conclaves, and we don't have a certain number of people vote on something. It's everybody that gets to be involved in it. So if you don't know, every single general conference, every annual general conference, at least in April, whether you're watching on TV or whether you're in person, they ask you, do you sustain these people as prophets, seers, and revelators? Do you like the 12 apostles, the 70s, Your local bishops, all of it. I have a calling. It's very small, but I love it. But people had to raise their hands and consent to it, or say, no, I don't. I disagree with this. So this, you can hearken this one all the way back to section 18. Very important stuff. And then for the rest of draft 2, we get this little statement here. It says, the following commandment will further illustrate the nature of our calling to this priesthood, as well as that of others who are yet to be sought after. So this is, again, kind of explaining that this revelation and all these revelations were used as sort of priesthood trainings of how to do your ministry, which is still what the Doctrine and Covenants is used for today. So a question arises then in some of the language of this, verse 8 specifically calling out that Joseph is sort of called to something else. Did Joseph and Oliver have their apostleship before any of the others did? Because they are being ordained as elders. And if you don't know, again, if you're an apostle in the church, your title is elder so-and-so, right? So footnote 8 from the Joseph Smith papers. This is out of Histories, Volume 1. This is the draft 2. But a footnote that we get from the editors of the Joseph Smith papers says, this passage could be evidence that the ordination of Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery to the apostleship took place before this revelation, soon after this declaration. Cowdery included his articles of faith, articles of the Church of Christ, with these words, behold, I am Oliver, I am an apostle of Jesus Christ by the will of God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. So we don't have an exact, we don't have like a big detailed account of Peter, James, and John coming down and restoring the Melchizedek priesthood, but apparently that already happened. They have been ordained elders and apostles and all that kind of stuff by the time this has happened, is what this footnote is implying. And so we also get some clarification from footnote 13 about when this might have happened. We get June 1829, but we also get this. Oliver Cowdery wrote to Hiram Smith on the 14th of June, 1829, urging him to stir up the minds of our friends against the time we come unto you, that when they may be willing to take up upon them the name of Christ, for that is the name by which they shall be called at the last day. And if we know not the name by which we are called, I fear we shall be found on the left hand. Similarly, the language between the revelation and this letter suggests that Joseph Smith dictated the revelation prior to 14th of June, 1829. So you get, I don't know, maybe June 1st to June 13th. So just a little bit of a narrowing in. And I just kind of love this sort of forensics that the editors of the Joseph Smith papers do. Like the amount of work, seriously, is amazing. So what's the aftermath of this, right? We get this from, again, the historical introduction and then some thoughts, and I'll close this out. It says, when Joseph Smith and Cowdery convened a meeting to select 12 apostles in February 1835, they refer to the proceedings as being a fulfillment of this revelation, section 18. Similarly, although the text featured here from the 1833 Book of Commandments refers to the calling of disciples, the 1835 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants describes the purpose of the same revelation as the calling of the 12 apostles, as does Joseph Smith's history begun in 1838. So, what do we get from this? Frankly, nothing for nearly 6 years. That's when you get the 12 apostles. And that year, 1835, is also important because if you look at the introductions, and let me see if I can find it here, but if you look at the introductions to the Doctrine and Covenants, there is similarly there it is right there, just past it. There is a witness page to the Doctrine and Covenants. Well, here it is here. So this is what you get. And these are the 12 apostles. They sort of put their hand to saying that the book of Doctrine and Covenants is a true record of revelations. It's not quite the same as the 8 witnesses and the 3 witnesses testimony because there's no artifacts to look at. There's none of that. But it does imply that there's, these 12 apostles' job is to evangelize this to the world. So that's where that comes from. So the order of these things seems to have been very important to this. We don't get that with the Book of Commandments. That predates this. But yeah, there is some time before they actually do find the 12. And the calling of those is very interesting. We'll get to that in a later episode. So there you go. Section 18, a lot about the 3 witnesses. They were not just there to witness to the Book of Mormon. They were also part of calling apostles, or in this case, we could call them disciples. And that is something that we hold to this day. We also get sacrament meetings, common consent, all that kind of stuff. So it's a very interesting section, and the only one that we're going to talk about today. So in the next part here, we're going to be talking a little bit more about the importance of record keeping and sort of the end of an era in the Joseph Smith Papers. So stay tuned. Okay, so this is part 2 of this episode from Filling in the History. And in this case, just kind of an opinion piece of something that struck me as I was looking at this. So this episode is just one section. It was just section 18. We don't have angels. We don't have plates. We've already talked about all of that. There's circumstances surrounding hiding the plates, and we've gone into all these extra things. And so I was really debating on what kind of a bonus round we would get on this one. Some episodes were so long I sort of forebore, whatever you want to call that. But in this case, I wanted to talk about something very interesting. So in the documents of the Joseph Smith Papers, from section 18 on, something changes. And that is, there's a more thorough record kept. So if you were to look at the document series, which is kind of a chronological view of just every scrap of paper we could possibly find, what's interesting is that what we've been reading so far is the order. There's been nothing really in between. So you get, a title page to the Book of Mormon, sections to the Doctrine and Covenants, but there's really not a whole lot more there. And that's because a lot of it was just lost. Later on in church history, there's a major edict from the Lord, if you will, from these Doctrine and Covenants sections, from these revelations, saying, you need to keep a record. There must be a record kept. But until then, a lot of it was lost. And so I don't think it's unreasonable. Again, I think it's it makes a lot of sense to me that things like the first vision, which is accounted 18 years later in 1838, first vision happens in 1820. Our official account of it is in 1838. That's a long time past. A lot of stuff surrounding the Book of Mormon. We get what we get. We get a couple of accounts. Joseph Smith's own mother gives an account, but that's after Joseph Smith passes away. And there's all these sort of things. There's not a whole lot of contemporary stuff, which leads it up to, there's a lot of people who attack the church over these events because there's really not a whole lot of documentation. On the flip side, though, a lot of believers will insert a lot of stuff that isn't there because they want it to maybe be more special than what we have records to prove. And so there's a lot of anecdotal things and storytelling and whatnot. And it just, rather than going into like the church history side of it, I wanted to just give kind of an opinion about the importance of your life. So this is the library. This section over here, if you've been wondering what these books are, those are actually journals of my family's life. This section up here, I'm pointing with my right hand for those of you on audio only. Those are a set of just handwritten journals. And I don't think that I've heard this much lately, but there used to be a strong admonishment to church members to keep a journal of your life. That's this book of remembrance that you see right here is actually a harken back to something from the Book of Moses and the Pearl of Great Price. That book is where I actually have a copy of my genealogy. I have aunts and uncles who served genealogical missions. If you don't know, we do that sort of thing where they just go in to research names and try to, find people from ancient records and things like that and put them into some sort of a safe digital backed up, form of whatever form that may be. And so I have a copy of that. And it's been very interesting doing genealogical research myself and also reading these journal, like church history, the Joseph Smith Papers especially. There's always a bit of mourning over there's a whole section of Revelation Book 1 that got torn out and never got put back. And they put the Book of Mormon manuscript in the cornerstone of the Nauvoo house, and it got water damaged and a lot of it's gone. And it's just sad. And so something that I feel strongly about is that I think our generation, this 21st century generation of human beings, because of things like social media, think that we've sort of recorded our lives. I would say there's probably a wider photographic and video record of any time in human history because of smartphones and things like that have made it possible. I'm doing it right now with this podcast. I would have never been able to do this like 15 years ago or 20 years ago. And I just find it interesting. I think it's important for us to record our lives. So this is just my opinion. Just reading all these documents, it's kind of sad when we just kind of have to fill in the gaps, what I've been trying to do, filling in the history. People do forensic stuff. They look at newspapers. They try to gather whatever they can. And at this point in church history, what's going to happen in section 19, we're going to get the last half of it. And then after that, you're going to get something called a letter book, which means that you're going to start actually seeing Joseph Smith's own handwriting, but it's actually Oliver Cowdery's letter. So what they used to do is they would receive a letter, they would make a copy into a book because they kind of felt like, and they were right, they're probably going to lose this letter somewhere along the way. And so they have this sort of record of it. And that letter book is the first time we really start to fill out the history at the time. And so just something for you out there listening, something for me to remember. I journal. I don't do every single day. I don't do diary style journaling. But what I do is if there's major events or hard things that have happened, which is actually one of the reasons why I started this podcast, something really tough happened to me in my life and in my family's life. And this has been a kind of my way of sort of doing something healthy and giving back. All that's recorded in a journal somewhere. And now it's recorded in this podcast, but I don't know if these things are going to last. But good things, bad things, ugly things, all of this stuff I think is worth remembering. So from the amateur historian to you, if you're not journaling, give it a shot. There's, we're living in a remarkable age where it's really easy to do if you want to get an app. If you want to go old school, kind of like what I do, because I think it's interesting to see somebody's handwriting and see their mistakes. These are actually handwritten journals that I've done. These over here on my left side, these are photo journals. And so the point is there's a lot of digital, but we don't make it into something concrete like a photograph anymore. And so I have decided to print them on paper. And of course, fires can happen and floods can happen. But in the meantime, I do think there's something to be said about that. So if there's anything that I've maybe taken away from the first portion of these first 2 months of doing this podcast and these episodes, is that I think our lives are worth remembering. You may have various thoughts about me or others, but I think for you personally, write it down or print those pictures off. Get a hard copy of it so that you have something to remember, so you have something to go back to. I know for myself, reading my own journals, it just comes back. Like the smells and the sights and the sounds and all of it just comes back to me. So just something to think as we move ahead with the Joseph Smith papers. And as church history becomes a little bit more robust, and there's a lot more, there's a Revelation book and a record book and a journal and a letter book and newspaper stuff, and all they kind of fills in a lot of those gaps. And frankly, that's not the stuff that people usually argue about when it comes to the truthfulness of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because there's a lot there. Let it be a reminder to us. I think your life is worth remembering. I hope my life was worth remembering, and maybe nobody will ever read this stuff, but I think there's something to saying like, hey, I just had a really interesting experience. It was good. It was bad. It was ugly. I'm going to write it down. And so anyway, just something to think about as we come to the close of the very early portions, these 1829 portions and before. It's a pity that a lot of it was lost. That's the nature of life, I suppose. And so, yeah, if you haven't, go get yourself a journal and remember your life. Anyway, so I'm the amateur historian. This has been Filling in the History, kind of a short episode this week. And hopefully we'll see you again next week. And, again, if you don't know, we're on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, like, subscribe, and do all the things. And thank you very much for joining me on this. I hope you've enjoyed it.